I think I would like to suggest we go ahead and get started. I know you still have your lunch in front of you, and you want to just encourage you to continue eating. Please don't feel at all uncomfortable about that. But we do have quite a bit of ground we want to cover today, and I want to make sure that we have enough time for some discussion and some conversation as well. So let me just start off, and then we'll just make it up as we go. Before I get started, let me mention to you that I have up here confirmation information forms for those of you who are planning on, hoping to, expecting to be either confirmed or received or to reaffirm your faith when Bishop Sumner makes his visit later this year. So if you are planning on confirmation or reception or reaffirmation, just raise your hand and I'll give you one of these sheets so that we can make sure that we've got this from you. Make sure I have that back before the end of the class today. You too, Esther? Yep.
So if we're not confirmed and we're coming from another church denomination, which I am, I'm also on staff there, but I'd like to be confirmed. So can I do that for this class, or are there other things I would need to do?
I believe that this class is the means whereby we prepare people for confirmation.
Okay.
There's both a youth confirmation preparation track and an adult confirmation preparation track. And maybe I should just talk for just a few seconds about what confirmation even is. If you're wondering, I don't even know what confirmation is. Do I want that? Do I not want that? If you are not a member of the Episcopal Church, if you do not currently have membership at a particular congregation, and you are wanting to officially align yourself with the Episcopal Church and be recognized as a member of such, confirmation is your front door into the Episcopal Church. Confirmation. We're actually going to talk a little bit about the sacrament of confirmation later today, so I don't want to get too deeply into this. But confirmation is the way that Episcopalians recognize a profession of faith by those who identify as Anglican, by those who identify as members of the Episcopal Church. So if you've been baptized in any other tradition, if you've been baptized with water in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, in any other Christian tradition, and are now wanting to align yourself with the Episcopal Church, confirmation is the way that you do that. You can be a member of St. Michael and All Angels without being a member of the Episcopal Church. So if you want to come to St. Michael, participate in the worship, go to the classes, do all, take part in the choir, do everything that members of St. Michael are able to do, but are not yet sure about the whole membership in the Episcopal Church thing, that's fine. You don't have to be a confirmed member of the Episcopal Church to be a member at St. Michael. So confirmation, membership in the Episcopal Church is kind of a formal declaration on your part that this articulation of the faith and practice of the Church is the one that makes the most sense to me and is going to be the way that I pursue the ongoing development of my life of faith. If that's something you're hoping for, something you're looking for, you don't, by any means, have to do it right now. There is no time-definite deadline for being confirmed or for seeking confirmation. You can be confirmed anytime in your life. So, all of that is to say, if you are interested in confirmation, if you are a member of another tradition that is in apostolic succession, we'll talk about that a little bit today. If you are in another tradition in apostolic succession, you will know what I'm talking about. If you're not, don't worry about it. But if you have been baptized and confirmed and want to be received into the Episcopal Church by the bishop, then that's the way that you would do that as well. And that also you can indicate on this form. So if you were Roman Catholic and were confirmed, if you're a Missouri Synod and were confirmed, if you're a Lutheran and were confirmed, and just don't need to be confirmed but would like to be received as an Episcopalian, again, this form is the way that you'd indicate that to us. So I know there's a lot more to be said about confirmation and baptism and apostolic succession and all of that stuff. We'll talk about that. But any logistical questions about the whole confirmation piece before I put these down?
And that is typically once a year, right?
That happens once a year, right. That happens when the bishop visits.
Later, then we would get this class.
Well, once you've completed the class, once you've completed the series of classes, you're good to go. And any time thereafter, you can be confirmed. So
you can think about it.
So you don't have to decide right this second.
You don't have to decide right this second, no. And if you wanted to decide, next week, if after hearing today's class you decide, oh, this is not for me, then that's fine. No problem at all. So, thank you for being here. If I didn't have an opportunity to meet you, my name is Father Andrew Grosso, and I'm the Associate for Worship and Liturgy here. This is the first in a series of classes on Anglican Christianity, on Episcopal Christianity. And you may already be wondering, well, why are you using both the words Anglican and the word Episcopal in the same sentence? What's the difference? What's the relationship between those two? We'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Today what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk specifically about the worship of the church and how the worship of the church and the sacraments of the church are understood within the context of the Episcopal Church in particular. I'm interested in hearing, though, what issues or questions you may want to discuss that have to do with worship and sacraments, because I expect whatever your background is, you have some familiarity, some sense already of what worship is and how worship is conducted and what a sacrament is and what a sacrament is not and why we have this many sacraments or that many. I mean, you've got some background in this somewhere. So what questions do you have? What particular themes or topics are of particular interest to you today that you'd like to make sure we cover, having to do with worship or sacraments? Please.
When people do the sign of the cross,
Okay.
is that formal? Is it appropriate or not? Or how do you do it? From the right or left? Or does it matter?
Sign of... And that's just one example of a whole range of behaviors that we might refer to as acts of piety. What are the acts of piety in the Episcopal Church that are typically, observed, that you might see people doing during a worship service? What do they mean? Why do they do it? Why do they do it at that point? Why don't they do, do I have to do something in order to be eligible to perform that? Or how does that work? So acts of piety. What else? Piety. Anything else? Genuflecting, I'm gonna put that under the acts of piety rubric. I'll just kind of make a note to make sure I don't miss it. Genuflection.
Why do they have two crosses? I'm sorry. You go ahead.
Okay. I'm interested in hearing about transubstantiation and the difference between
Okay.
how Episcopalians and Catholics think about that.
Okay, and we might put that under the broader rubric of sacramental theology. What happens in baptism, right? What happens in the Eucharist? When we celebrate the Eucharist, how do we understand the presence and the activity of Christ? There's different ways of articulating that in different Christian traditions. What do we as Episcopalians believe about that? Sir? Did you have your hand up? Or I'll come back to you in a minute here.
What is the difference between right one and right two?
Right one and right two, okay? We will definitely get to that. Robert, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was, when they come in with two crosses, what's the significance of the first and the second?
Okay. That we might put under the broader rubric of ceremonial. Why do we do it this way? Why does the altar have that cloth on it? Why is the pulpit over there and not over there? Why is the liturgical environment shaped the way that it is? Everything, you will probably hear me say this more than once, everything in the liturgy is intended to mean something. When you look at the position of the altar, it signifies something. When you look at the position of the pulpit vis-a-vis the lectern, it means something, because in some other congregations, they're reversed. Why is that the case? Why is the altar there and not the pulpit there? Why are all of it? Everything means something. So the better sense you have of why particular things are done at particular times, the richer your experience of worship can be. Any other? Please, ask me.
I heard that the windows in the sanctuary tell a story. What story is it?
It's actually the story of the whole creation. The window in the very back is the creation window, and then the ones along the side begin with the story of the incarnation, lead up to the cross, and then continue on to the apocalypse, the revelation window. So it's pretty much the narrative of the New Testament with the creation featured in the back window as well. So. Others, please?
Will you cover like the daily office?
Indeed I will. Yep. Indeed I will. Okay, good.
And why are there 15 different versions of it?
That's interesting. I'm curious to hear about that because there's actually two versions of that. There's the right one and the right two. Okay, Good. These are exactly the kinds of questions that I'm hoping we can discuss. You should have a prayer book, and you should have an outline on your table. We're not going to, read out of those things all the time, but hopefully they'll give you a sense of how to follow along. You will see at the top of your handout a quotation from Richard Hooker. Hooker was an Anglican theologian, Church of England, 16th century. He is recognized as having been one of the first theologians to provide a really robust account of the faith and practice of the Church of England. Hooker's Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity were written during a time when the English Church was trying to distinguish itself from Roman Catholicism and also distinguish itself from Protestantism. In the 16th century, just think about what was going on. Protestant Reformation was up and running. All manner of people were going around saying, we're the true Christians, we're the true Christians, they're a false church, they're a false church. And there's this question about the Church of England. How can they justify calling themselves a legitimate church when they're no longer in fellowship with the Bishop of Rome? How can they justify calling themselves a real church when they do crazy pagan things like baptize infants? Some of the Protestants were saying that. Hooker and others set out what were basically apologies or defenses for the faith and practice of the Church of England. And the quote at the top here is from Hooker's Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. I'm just going to read this quick. For if the best things have the most perfect and best operations, it will follow that, seeing as to how humans are the worthiest creatures upon earth, and every society is more worthy than any individual, and of societies, the most excellent of which is the church, there can then be in this world no work performed equal to the exercise of true religion, the proper operation of the Church of God. In other words, Hooker is saying worship is the point of human life. Worship is the consummation and the fulfillment of every human life. And there's no greater work that any human person can do than share in the worship of God. So, Hooker says, worship is important. Worship is so important that we have to think carefully about it. And that's the thing that I thought would be a nice introduction to today's discussion. I want to say a couple things about worship in general under section 1 here before we get into the nuts and bolts of the Book of Common Prayer and Sacramental Theology. And it's really these first couple of points that in some respects are actually the most important. All the rest of the details, they're significant, they're important, it's fun to talk about that stuff. I'll enjoy getting to those discussions. But really the first section here is the part that I want you to kind of latch on to. And the first thing I want to say is this. Worship is more appropriately thought of as something that God does for us rather than something that we do for God. And I think that's counterintuitive to the way that most of us approach our experience of church and our experience of worship. We think of church as this place that we get up and go to, and then we file in, and we sit down, and we pick up our books, and we say stuff, and we sing songs, and we do things, and we think that what we're doing is offering worship to God. And that's true, but the only reason that's true is because of what God is doing for us. Worship is an opportunity that God gives to us for the sake of changing and transforming us. Worship, in other words, is a gift that God gives to us to bring us into relationship with himself. So worship is primarily about what God does, and only in a secondary sense what we do. We participate in and we share in what we believe God is doing when we come together as community. But what we don't do when we come together as community is presume that we somehow have to convince God to join us, right? Or convince God to do something, because God's action always precedes ours. Before we got up Sunday morning and thought about coming to church and dressing up and doing all that stuff, God was already present and active. God was already moving. God was already pouring out the gift of worship on the church and the gift of worship on the world and inviting the world into that relationship. So the reason I'm kind of hammering this is because anytime you think about any act of worship, I don't care what act of worship we're talking about in the Book of Common Prayer. If we're talking about the Eucharist, if we're talking about baptism, if we're talking about the daily office, if we're talking about ordination, if we're talking about burial, if we're talking about marriage, whatever it is we're talking about, those acts are always first and foremost about what God is doing and how we join in and participate in those actions. Worship is never a matter of us doing something ourselves and putting a little bit of religious window dressing on it and hoping that God will somehow bless it. Worship is our opportunity to try and figure out what God is already doing in the world and then align ourselves with God's presence and activity. And we come back week after week after week after week because we need to be reminded, this is how the world works. This is how the world works. This is how the world works. Because the world doesn't work this way anywhere else. Right? It works according to a completely different set of standards and a completely different set of expectations in which we are responsible for getting things done. It's not like that in church. And it's not like that in the world. But we forget that. So we come to church to be reminded that our experience in church is always first and foremost about what God is doing for us and not what we are doing for God. Okay? Thoughts about that? Questions about that? I mean, how did that sound? Did that kind of... Wonderful. We're off to a good start. I've got 2 points or 3 points here under this section A. Maybe it'd help if I had my reading glasses on. I probably already said something heretical and didn't even know. Worship provides the start, the finish, and the motive energies of our lives. In other words, when we enter into the experience of worship as something that God does for us rather than something we do for God, then what we do is we recognize that worship provides the starting point from which we can build a life. Worship represents the end point towards which we can move as we develop and cultivate a life of worship, and worship provides the motive energy along the way. So worship, in other words, teaches us who we are, teaches us where we should be going, and provides us with the motivation along the way to keep going. Worship is about playing the long game. I've already mentioned that worship involves sharing in the presence and the activity of the triune God. It is first and foremost the worship of Jesus Christ that we participate in that makes worship what it is. Our worship to God is offered to the Father through the Son in the power of the Spirit. It's not as if God's life is lived over here somehow and God exists as Father, Son, and Spirit over here in the corner somewhere, and then we have a relationship with God that is apart from that life. Rather, our life, our experience, our relationship with God involves our sharing in the worship that the Son himself offers to the Father in and through the Spirit. And this is why when I was talking earlier about worship as something God does for us, that's why worship is an invitation. Worship is an invitation to sharing in that life. God is basically opening up the divine life to us and saying, why don't you come and be a part of this? Why don't you come and experience this? Experience this kind of love, this kind of power, this kind of mercy, and this kind of grace. Because that's what I have for you. And when we experience worship in that way, that's a very different experience of worship than when we feel that what we have to do is gin up a certain set of emotions or, keep our mind focused on a particular idea or observe certain practices or whatever. Rather, it's always about sharing in what God has already done for us. It's because of these points that I have a polite disagreement with the Catechism. And if you want to kind of go to the spot where I'm looking, you don't have to, but if you wanted to look at the spot where I'm looking at, I'm working off page 857 of the Book of Common Prayer. The last article in the teaching on worship suggests strongly that worship is something we do. We get together, we join ourselves to one another, we do this, we do that. I think that's just a bad articulation. It's not that that is wrong. It's not that the framers of the prayer book, really missed the boat on that one. I'm using this as kind of a device for highlighting the importance that I believe recognizing the priority of God's action has for any right understanding of worship. If we begin with the assumption that worship is about what we're doing, we will not be worshiping fully, because we will not be sharing in the work that God is doing that makes our worship possible. And when you think about it, that's just, especially when you think about what that means for particular acts of worship, like marriage. Marriage is not primarily about the two people who are being married. It's primarily about what God is doing in the lives of those two people. Or in a burial. A burial is not primarily about the person who's being buried. It's about the work that God is doing in redeeming the one who's being buried. Now, we participate in all of those actions, but we participate in something that God does first and foremost and on our behalf.
So would you say, if we were created to primarily worship God, but we can't worship Him apart from Him?
Yeah.
So in a sense, I'm not having to come here to try to worship God. I'm making myself available to Him.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way of putting it. Worship is primarily about learning the vulnerability that's necessary to surrender ourselves to God. Not coming with the expectation that we have something God needs, right?
Well, that's great.
We have nothing that God, I would say, yeah, we have nothing that God needs, right? I mean, this is why worship is a gift that God gives to us rather than a gift that we give to God, because God doesn't need a thing. God's fine. We are in desperate need. And it is God's gift to us to allow worship to be the means whereby we receive the gifts that God has. Another phrase that you will hear, or a phrase that you will often hear Episcopalians talk about, is this point B here. Lex orandi, lex credendi. The rule of worship is the rule of faith. And this comes from the writings of Prosper of Aquitaine, who was a 5th century theologian, who was trying to work out at the time the question of the relationship between the scriptures and the teachings of the church and the worship of the church. And one of the things that Prosper concluded was that the best theology will inspire worship. So if you're and think about the controversies that were raging in the church at the time about the divinity of Jesus and the humanity of Jesus and how we understand the incarnation and the relationship between the Father and the Son. All that stuff was being kind of debated heatedly. Prosper, I think, made the very insightful observation that the best doctrines, the best account of incarnation, the best account of the life of God and the doctrine of the Trinity and all of that stuff will be a doctrine that inspires worship. So if you have a doctrine that moves you towards piety, that moves you towards worship, that's probably a good doctrine. And if your experience of worship likewise informs your thinking, then you'll have kind of a self-reinforcing cycle there whereby worship will draw you deeper into the mystery of God and thereby invite you to a deeper understanding of who God is. Who is this God we're worshiping? Why are we worshiping? What's the relationship between the Father and the Son? And what's this? What is this? Those questions all follow from our experience of worship. But then the conclusions to which we come as a result of our reflections should drive us back into worship again. So Prosper is setting up a relationship, a very dynamic relationship here between worship, theological reflection, reading on the scriptures, and what he's basically saying is all these things have to kind of coordinate. And if the doctrines that you think about when you're doing your scholarly academic work move you to piety and move you to worship, that's good doctrine. And when your worship draws you deeper into understanding and invites a deeper understanding on your part, a better articulation of discipleship, that's good worship. And when those two things work together to give you a better sense of what the scriptures are actually saying, that's good worship. So the formula that worship and belief are intertwined has been very important for the Roman Catholic Church, for Western Christianity broadly speaking, and for the Anglican Church as well. This is one of the points at which the Protestants kind of departed a little bit from this tradition in the West. And I don't mean to offend any of my Protestant brothers and sisters at this point, but the Protestant emphasis on sola scriptura kind of minimized the importance of worship as a living tradition and the way in which the worship of the church, the tradition of the church, functions relative to the faith of the church and the reading of the scriptures. Prosper and others who followed that line of thinking kept a much more dynamic relationship between those three than we've had in some quarters since the 16th century. Much more could be said about that. I'm just going to kind of let that go for now. But the other piece of this that I want you to notice is part C. This should lead to right worship, should lead to right belief. Both of those together should lead to right living, right? Lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi. You should have a life that is inspired by your worship, by your theological reflection, by your articulation of belief. I believe this because I've thought about this. I have some understanding of what I'm talking about. That drives me to worship, but it also informs the way I do the rest of my life. That last piece, lex vivendi, means that there is no part of your life, no dimension of your life that worship is not intended to touch. Worship is not something that only happens on Sunday morning between 9 and 10 or between 11 and 12. Worship is what happens in the rest of your life as well. But it's harder to worship in the rest of life than it is on Sunday morning between 9 and 10 when you're with a group of people in a nice, beautiful building doing something wonderful like celebrating the Eucharist. How does my experience of worship, how does my understanding of the faith, how does my credendi, my confession, how does that inform my approach to my family? How does that inform my approach to my job? How does that inform my approach to my free time or to my money or to whatever? I mean, you pick it. Every dimension of life is caught up in the experience of worship. So worship is likewise intended to inform every dimension of life. And again, that's why we come to church week after week after week, because we come here to learn what it means to be Eucharistic people, not just on Sunday morning, but on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, etc. How does my identity as a baptized Christian inform this difficult relationship I'm having with this person? There's a story about Martin Luther, who used to use baptism in that way. When he found himself kind of being pulled off track or going in a direction he didn't want to go, Luther would stop and remind himself, I've been baptized. I've been baptized. I've been baptized. And he would just remember, what is that? What did that mean? What is baptism about? What does baptism signify? And what does that mean for what's going on right now? So, lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi, worship, creed or belief, and life all kind of mixed together in a very dynamic relationship. They're not collapsed into one another, but they're intended to very much to inform one another. Anything from that first section? Questions, thoughts, pushback? Anything I said that sounded scary or bad or unexpected? Okay. Pushing on? Pushing on. The Book of Common Prayer. If you want to talk about Episcopal worship, all we really have to talk about is the Book of Common Prayer because everything's right there. So what you've got there on the outline is a very sketchy summary of the development of what you now have in front of you, the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. And the history of the prayer book, obviously, is very much tied up with the history of the English Reformation. That begins in 1532 or so, when Henry VIII begins breaking away from the Church of Rome. There's a lot more going on there than just the fact that Henry wants a divorce. Henry did want a divorce. That was not the only reason. I mean, this is kind of that's a very superficial reading of the English Reformation. Well, Henry wanted an heir, he didn't have one, he wanted a divorce, couldn't get one, he broke with Rome. Yeah, yes, but that was the presenting issue in a long history of other issues that were related to the relationship between the Church in England and the Church on the continents and what was going on in Western Christianity, broadly speaking. It's a little more complicated than just Henry wanted a divorce. But 1532, Henry begins to disassociate from Rome. The Church of England becomes independent. That prompts a whole series of not only religious changes in England, but also political changes, cultural changes, social changes. I mean, it was a big deal. It was not just a matter of this church, is no longer in affiliation with that church. At the time, the church was so thoroughly woven into the fabric of society that any major religious controversy or disruption had profound social and cultural and even political ramifications. And Henry was motivated as much by political concerns as he was by concerns about divorce and remarriage and all the rest of it. So from that time, roughly until, there's arguments about this, but roughly until the time of the ratification of the 1662 prayer book, you've got this ongoing process of change and development and transformation. So over roughly a period of 130 years, there was not a prayer book ready to hand in 1532 when Parliament and Henry declared themselves free of Roman control. So that took a little bit of time to develop. But that's the framework within which we're working. We're working between the years of basically 1532 and 1662, from the reign of Henry VIII to the reign of James I. And during that time, it's a time of obviously tremendous cultural, intellectual, political change and foment and development. And there's just all kinds of stuff happening, right? The medieval period had well and truly wrapped up. The Renaissance was well underway. Most of European culture at the time was kind of self-consciously embracing this new modern mindset. There was clearly a sense that new things were happening. So the changes that were happening at that time were not just religious in nature. And the church is trying to absorb all this stuff and to try and figure out what all this means for the way we understand the structure of the church, the governance of the church, the worship of the church, the confession of the church, all of that stuff. Please.
Is there somewhere to get a history of what you just said? I'm kind of provocative. 'Cause
Yeah.
I thought it was all about the divorce.
Yeah.
I don't know of any other examples of it being anything else.
Yeah.
This-
Behind the scenes.
So I'd
Yeah.
like to know.
Oh, there's several. Yeah.
So I'm interested in a history, but also current history
Yeah.
of what's going on in Dallas.
Yeah.
In this diocese.
In this particular diocese.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a bunch of stuff actually on the back of the handout. At the bottom of that page, there's a list of resources there, most of which are specific to the study of the liturgy. But several of these do engage necessarily in some historical work as well and some contemporary analysis as well.
Is there somewhere specifically, if there are concerns
Yeah.
about specifically local church politics?
Yeah.
Is there somewhere to go to find that?
Why don't let you and I talk about
Okay,
that afterwards?
That's totally fair.
Simply because I want to hear a little bit more about what you have in mind by specific concerns, because specific concerns do have specific resources, so I don't want to just say,
I understand.
well, go read this, because I'm not sure that it would be helpful to you. But I'd be happy to talk about that later. And if you want, I mean, some of the other classes that you'll take as part of this series will probably touch on Anglican history a bit more deeply and all that kind of stuff. But if you're interested in resources specifically having to do with the English Reformation and all that stuff, happy to provide that stuff. Just let me know. So, the two big, I'm just going to kind of give you a thumbnail sketch of how this works, how the English Reformation plays out. The Church of England finds itself, as it were, I mean, I don't like military language here, but fighting along two fronts, because they're having to defend themselves over and against Roman Catholic claims that the Church of England has lost the faith and is no longer a legitimate church, right? And not without reason. I mean, that's a pretty big break, for 700 years. The Church of England and the Church of Rome had pretty much been in full communion, and now all of a sudden, no, we're not anymore. That's a big deal. Why not? Are the sacraments valid now? Is ordination valid now? Are they rightly preaching the Word of God now? Are they still true Christians? And at the same time, they're also fighting along the Protestant front, because by this time, Luther, John Calvin, all them, I mean, they're the Anabaptists, they are all up and running. And there are, especially in England, not only in England, but in England, the Puritans and the Anabaptists, kind of the radical end of the Reformers, are making similar claims about the Church of England. They're not true Christians because they baptize infants and they do all that weird popish stuff and they wear vestments and they have candles and all that nonsense. And we are now true Christians in ways that they're... So the Church of England kind of has it coming at them from both ends, right? So they find themselves having to articulate an identity that recognizes the questions from both ends of the spectrum and tries to embrace the strengths and the contributions from both ends of the spectrum while also maintaining their integrity. And that's Hooker's laws are intended to do that. Cranmer's, the Book of Common Prayer, when that first gets put out, that's intended to do that. Everything the Church of England is trying to do during that period that I've just described is aimed at simultaneously addressing concerns from the rest of Western Christendom, Roman Catholic Church, about why the Church of England still stands in continuity with the broader Catholic tradition, while also addressing Protestant concerns about why the Church of England is a legitimate church, despite the fact that they haven't reformed quite to the same degree that the Anabaptists have. And all of that has political ramifications as well. Because oftentimes, whether or not you were aligned with Rome had something to do with what you thought about the idea of monarchy. Should a king rule people or not? Or should governments be organized democratically? Or should parliament be in control? Or what's the relationship between the parliament and the king? What's the relationship between the parliament and the people? Who's in charge? Should the common people be running the government, or should we leave that to the, all of that stuff is wrapped up with questions about the nature of the church and the structure of the church and the governance of the church. Which is why Hooker's book on Anglican faith and practice is called The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. Hooker is trained as a lawyer. He knows what he's doing, not only as a theologian, but he also knows what he's doing with regards to law and all the rest of it. So Hooker is trying not only to provide an account for what the church looks like, but what the proper relationship between the church and the state looks like, and what the proper relationship between the church and the culture looks like. So Hooker's kind of, and again, he's not the only one doing this, but Hooker's trying to kind of map out a whole new way of being Christian in the world during a time in which all of that stuff is up for grabs. And you'll remember from your history, Henry dies, leaves an heir, Edward VI, very young, not well, rather sickly, dies young. Not much gets accomplished during his reign. During his reign, some of those who were in the church who were trying to move the church in a more Protestant direction make a big push, and they think, okay, we're going to get some more reforms, because Henry's very conservative theologically. He's not interested in radical reform by any stretch of the imagination. Henry, before his death and before he breaks with Rome, at one time was recognized as defender of the faith by the Pope himself. So Henry is not a radical reformer. Henry just wants a very conservative, traditional revolution. Those who come after him, not so much. That happens under Edward's reign. Edward dies young. Edward dies quickly. Mary takes over. Another of Henry's children from another marriage. Mary is Roman Catholic. She is serious Roman Catholic. So she tries to pull England back towards Roman Catholicism. That doesn't go over too well, not only for religious reasons, but for political reasons as well. So her reign is relatively short. Elizabeth I comes to power. She seeks a compromise. She sees all this turmoil going on. We need to do something that is, she's looking for Big Tent Christianity, right? She's got to keep the Puritans happy, keep the Roman Catholics happy. We've got to tolerate all these different faiths. And then eventually we get to James I. There's some further turmoil along the way. James kind of picks up the mantle that Elizabeth first kind of initiates. After James I, I'm doing this very quickly, sorry for just kind of running through this. After James I, Charles I comes along. Charles tries to take the country back in a much more Catholic direction, makes a lot of people very angry. Cromwell and the Commonwealth come along. Kings are out. Book of Common Prayer is out. Bishops are out. All of that's out. Well, not really. Charles II comes to the throne. Book of Common Prayer is restored. Bishops are restored. Church of England is restored. And it's under Charles I that we get the ratification of the 1662 prayer book, which, in fact, is still the official prayer book of the Church of England. Now, the Church of England has since that time ratified a whole shelf full of other liturgical materials that you can use in worship. But if you were to ask, what is the official prayer book of the Church of England? The short answer to that is the prayer book of 1662. That was ratified under Charles II. So all of that stuff, all that political stuff and the social stuff and the cultural stuff, all of that is in play as Anglicans are trying to figure out what it means to be Anglican. Why are we not Roman Catholic? Are we still Catholic? Well, yeah, we're still Catholic, but we're just not Roman. Are we Protestant? Well, not really, but we're not Catholic, so we're kind of Protestant. So the tag that comes along that begins to be used to identify Episcopal or Anglican faith during this time is Catholic and Reformed. That kind of captures the both and rather than the either or. In 1764, something happens that is going to be important for the American church, and that is the Scottish church ratifies its own prayer book. For those of you who might know something about American church history, the history of the Episcopal Church in America, that presents an opportunity when when the colonies break away from Great Britain. Is the Church of England going to be allowed to continue to exist in the colonies? Well, no, because you can't have the Church of England without bishops, and we don't want bishops because bishops owe fealty to the crown. And we have just decided no fealty to the crown, so no bishops. Aha, but there's the Scottish church up there, and they are non-juring. They don't owe fealty to the crown. Let's go get our bishops ordained there. So we send a couple of people over to the Scottish bishops saying, will you ordain some bishops for the American church? And the Scots say, sure, provided you adopt some of our liturgical practices. Sounds good? We'll do that. So when the Americans ratify their first prayer book in 1789, it draws on both the 1662, the English book, but it also draws on the 1764 Scottish book. So we're kind of blending those two particular traditions. And then since that time, since 1789, you had a revision in 1892, which was a very light, very conservative tradition or revision of the 1789, just basically cleaning up a few details here and there. The 1928 at the time was thought to be a very kind of forward-looking, very contemporary, kind of a much more extensive revision than the revision of the 1892. Now we look back on the 1928 and we think, oh, that's so old and it's so traditional and it's so... In its day, the 1928 was kind of cutting edge. This was kind of, oh, we're taking a radical step here. And then the last revision that we have is the 1979. And that, like many other prayer book revisions that were happening at the time in Western Christendom, that took into account the fruit of basically 75 to 100 years of historical and liturgical scholarship in early Christianity. There was so much that was learned between 1850 and 1950 in terms of early Christianity, not just in biblical studies, but liturgical studies, all manner of... We knew a lot more at the end of that 100 years about early Christianity than we had before. And one of the things we knew more about was the worship of the early church. So we took that into account in the 79 prayer book. So that's how we got what you've got on your table. So let me pause there before I get into kind of the major sections of the prayer book and just see if there's any questions specifically about the history. Any historical...
Oh, this is course talk. I want to come down.
I think it's once a year. Well, it's being videotaped, so...
Oh.
You're just recorded.
You have been immortalized. So let me suggest you open your prayer book now and go to the table of contents at the very front. I want to kind of just walk you through this thing. And the most important thing to remember here is that the prayer book is intended as a manual for daily devotion. It is not intended as something you only pick up on Sunday morning and then put down as soon as the worship service is over. Back in the day, you brought your prayer book with you to church because you were using it at home, right? And you would use it at home, and you would, use it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then you would bring it with you to church as well. When churches started kind of providing prayer books, people kind of got out of that habit. And when they got out of that habit, then they no longer used the prayer book on a daily basis. But this thing is really intended to be a devotional resource that is designed for basically every day of every week, of every month, of every year, of your whole life. This covers you basically from cradle to grave. There is a prayer for every occasion in there. Sorry?
Do you sell these in the bookstore?
Yeah, you can get these in the bookstore. Yeah, and you can get them. They're easy to find. You can even get special editions with like gold on the edges and the whole 9 yards. So, what do you have in the prayer book? The first big chunk, I would say, includes daily rites for daily use and devotion. This is kind of the meat and potatoes of the Christian life. Basically from page 1 all the way through to page 263. So that's a big chunk. This is where the daily office is located. We'll talk specifically about the office in just a moment. But in addition to the daily office, you have a whole bunch of prayers in here. You have the collects every Sunday after when the service opens. We have the collect for purity. Then we sing the Gloria. And then right after that, the celebrant will usually say, "The Lord be with you and also with you. Let us pray." And then the celebrant prays something called a collect. This is where it comes from in the prayer book. And the collects are basically a whole cycle of prayers that are offered throughout the different seasons of the church year that are specific to the particular observance or the particular season that we're commemorating at that particular point. We are now in the season of Lent, so our collects are going to look different. And when we get to the season of Easter, our collects are going to look different. And when we get to the season of Advent, the collects are going to look different. That kind of thing. When I said we're now in the season of Lent, I was speaking hypothetically. We're not really in the season of Lent. So that, after you get through the daily devotion stuff, then you get to what I have referred to on the outline as the pillar and bulwark of the Book of Common Prayer. It's a very short section, but it is, I would argue, the most important section in the whole prayer book. Proper liturgies for special days. And what you have there is a relatively few, 6 in fact, rites specifically for observance from the beginning of Lent, Ash Wednesday, through Easter, the Great Vigil of Easter. Those services, and in particular the Great Vigil of Easter, are the most important in the book. Every other service in the book, in some way, shape, or form, finds its logic in the Great Vigil of Easter. That is the principal act of worship that the Church offers year after year after year. And I don't care if you're talking about weekly Eucharist, or if you're talking about baptism, or if you're talking about ordination, or if you're talking, well, I don't care what you're talking about. Every other service, in some way, shape, or form, follows from the logic that is represented by the Great Vigil of Easter. So if you want to get to know the prayer book, read the Vigil. And that will kind of give you a starting point for anywhere else you want to go. Then after that, you have what I have referred to as the public services of the local church, baptism and Eucharist. The local church in Anglican and in Episcopal faith is not the congregation. The local church is the diocese. So when you speak in terms of membership in the local church within the context of Anglican faith and practice, if someone were to ask you, where is your home church? You would not be wrong if you said the Diocese of Dallas. I'm a member of the diocese. I worship at St. Michael, or I worship at whatever, St. John, or I worship at Transfiguration. But each of those is nothing more than an outpost of the Diocese of Dallas. Because the church is most fully represented when the bishop, the clergy, and the laity are gathered together. So in Episcopal faith and practice, the presence and the ministry of the bishop is central for understanding the identity and the mission of the church. You can't have the church without a bishop. When the bishop and the clergy and the people are gathered in the celebration of the sacraments, there is the church. Which is why we say that the local church within the context of Anglican faith and practice is the diocese. So, baptism and Eucharist are the two rites that regulate the life of the local church. Baptism is the rite we use to draw people into the life of the church. This is the rite that enables people to join the covenant community and to say, this is the pattern of life that I'm going to observe. And then the Eucharist is the week-to-week, sometimes day-to-day celebration of the mighty act of salvation that God accomplishes on our behalf, that we participate in, and that we use to try and order the rest of our life. Baptism's a one and done. You don't need to do that more than once. But the Eucharist you do as often as you can. Because the Eucharist is that sacrament that has been given to us as a way of shaping and forming and directing the rest of our lives. And we'll talk about why that's the case in just a few minutes. After that, you've got some other services for regulating the life and the ministries of the church: confirmation, marriage, burial, ordination, etc. All of those are events in the life of the church. I mentioned earlier that when we think of marriage, when we think of burial, when we think of whatever act it is, it's not primarily about us, always primarily about God. It's equally true to say that those acts are first and foremost always about the church. When two people are married, the whole church is transformed. When someone is baptized and brought into the communion of the church, the whole church is transformed. When someone is ordained, the whole church is transformed. So every act of worship, every rite that's in the prayer book, is properly observed within the context of the regular worship of the community. In other words, there's no such thing as a private ordination or a private baptism or a private this or a private that, because anything that happens within the context of the life of the church. And then we've got what is actually one of the longer chunks of the prayer book is the Psalms. Not quite 300, but 250 pages or so. That is the inheritance that we have from Israel. That is one of the means that we continue to share in the worship of Israel. Then you have a series of prayers and thanksgivings, prayers for every occasion. You have a very brief catechism in the back. What exactly does the church believe about this, that, or the other? And then you finally have what I referred to in the very back as the instructions. You have some historical documents. You've got the lectionary. You've got a bunch of other stuff that is designed to give you some sense of how to actually use this thing. So that's the prayer book. And it is something, I'm repeating myself now, but it bears repeating. It is something that is intended to be available to you as a resource for daily use. There's a lot more in here than just Holy Eucharist Rite 2 or Holy Eucharist Rite 1. Whatever your service of choice is, there's a ton of stuff in here that is designed to help you pray, designed to help you grow in your understanding of the faith, designed to help you grow in the way you live out your life of faith, This thing is kind of your one-stop shop. If you've got this in the Bible, you are good to go. Questions about any of that? About the major kind of sections of the organization of the prayer book?
I may be taking this too literally, but on some pages there's actual dates. Like if I were trying to do a traditional daily devotion, I would follow January 1 through December 31st. Each day would have a reading and a different devotion.
Yeah.
This does, like on page 234, it says the Sunday closes September 21st.
Yeah.
Does it start at January and go through December in a sense?
Well, let's just talk about that for a moment. There's actually two lectionaries. There's two cycles that the church uses to organize its devotions. One is a Eucharistic cycle, and one is the cycle of the daily office. And if you go to the back of the prayer book, let's say go to page, go to page 899. Or go to page 900. There you go. Let's see if I can do this real quick. Daily office. Yep. The daily office. Yep. So let me just see if I can help us recognize how this works. Okay, there we go. So are you on page 900?
Yes.
Okay, now just keep your finger in that page and also flip to page 988 and keep a finger in both pages. 988. Okay, so what we've got on page 900 is the Eucharistic lectionary. These are the readings and the devotions that we use Sunday to Sunday to Sunday. Right? So each Sunday has a particular designation. It is the fourth Sunday in Advent. It is the third Sunday in Lent. It is the second Sunday after the Epiphany, etc., etc. Every Sunday has a particular designation according to where it stands relative to the two principal feasts of the church year, Easter and Christmas. One of those feasts moves, the other one does not. Christmas never moves. We always know when Christmas is going to be. Easter, moving target. But the rest of the church calendar is organized around those two feasts. So once you figure out where Christmas falls and where Easter falls in any given calendar year, you've got everything you need to map out the rest of the church year. And if what you're doing is mapping out weekly worship, you use this lectionary. You use the Eucharistic lectionary. There's a 3-year cycle, year A, year B, and year C. And each year focuses on, the gospel readings are kind of the things that most clearly distinguish the 3 years. One of those years focuses primarily on the Gospel of Matthew, one of them focuses primarily on Mark, and one of them focuses primarily on Luke. Now what about John, you're wondering? We get a nice big healthy dose of John every Lent and every Easter. So John is kind of before us all the time, but the full narrative of the Johannine Gospel is not presented with quite the regularity that the three synoptic Gospels are presented. Please.
And over the course of those 3 years, will the church then read the entire Bible, or?
Not all of it. Most of it, but not all of it. Yeah. And part of it depends upon what the practice at the local congregation is. Do you use all 3 lessons that are on offer, or do you just use 2 lessons? At our 11 o'clock service, 11 o'clock traditional, we use all 3 lessons. At our 9 o'clock, you don't. So even if we used all 3 lessons every Sunday, all 3 years, you'd hear the majority of the scripture, but you wouldn't hear every bit of it. So that's the Eucharistic lectionary. And then the Eucharistic lectionary, the Eucharistic calendar, Sunday to Sunday to Sunday to major observance to major observance, that determines where we are for the observance of the daily office. Flip now to page 988. And you will see here proper 23, proper 24. The propers are those Sundays that follow the celebration of Pentecost. So Pentecost is kind of the last, let's see, how do I put this? It's the feast that inaugurates the season that follows Easter. After the season of Easter, we celebrate Pentecost. Immediately after Pentecost, we celebrate Trinity. And from that point on, we observe the propers for the rest of the church year. And where you start those propers, you may not start with proper number 1 or proper number 2, depending on where in the calendar you are. Does proper 1 fall in early April, or does it fall in May? depending on where the first Sunday after Pentecost falls, you're going to start on one or another of the propers. You may start on proper 1, you may start on proper 5, you may start on proper 7, and then you follow from there through the rest of the year. The daily office has readings for every day of the year. Every calendar day of the year has its own designation for evening prayer, for morning prayer, and for evening prayer. And you'll see that there's two groups. Let's just look at proper 23 on page 988, the top left side, the very top reading. Sunday, proper 23. 146 and 147. What's that? The two psalms designated for morning prayer. 111, 112, 113. What are those? The three psalms designated for evening prayer. And then you've got a reading from Jeremiah, a reading from Acts, and a reading from Luke. And if you want to do 2 of those readings in the morning and 1 of them in the evening, that's fine. If you want to do 2 in the morning and 2 in the evening, we can accommodate that. You just reach over and grab the Old Testament lesson from the opposing year and do it during whichever service needs an extra lesson. So the calendar for the office is connected to the calendar for the Eucharist, and they both pretty much follow the cycle of observances that are marked by Christmas and Easter. You will get through more of the Scripture if you go through the daily office than you will if you just listen to the Eucharistic lectionary. The other thing to notice about the Eucharist, one of the differences between these two, is that when you go through the daily office, again, look at 988, and just look down the Old Testament readings for proper 23. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Jeremiah 36, Jeremiah 36, Jeremiah 36, Jeremiah 37, Jeremiah 38. It's a sequential narrative reading through the Scriptures. Eucharistic lectionary, you often don't find that. You'll find that for the Gospel reading, for the most part. But the Old Testament reading jumps around, the Epistle reading jumps around, and is thematically connected to the Gospel reading. So, there's daily devotions and weekday devotions. Let me very quick, see, please.
It's what connected to the Gospels?
Thematically. The theme of the Gospels is kind of what, or conceptually, yeah. So, well, like today's a good example. We had a story in the Gospels about the healing of the Samaritan lepers. Oh, there's a story in the Old Testament about the healing of a leper. Click. That's why those were brought together. Yeah.
This may sound stupid, but do you need a King James Bible?
Indeed, no. You can use any Bible you want.
Use
Any Bible you want. Although, I mean, your question's apropos, because when James I was putting together the Revised Prayer Book, when he was kind of, inheriting the legacy that had been left to him, as part of his effort to shore up the faith and practice of the Church of England, he undertook prayer book revision. At the same time, he was undertaking biblical revision. The development of the authorized version, the King James Bible, was happening at the same time that James was undertaking to revise the prayer book. So the prayer book and the prayer book and the Bible were very much developed during the reign of James in tandem with the expectation that here are the two things you need to rightly observe the faith of the church. But
I just didn't know if you needed specifically.
Any Bible will do. The version that we use most often, there are some congregations that will use a different version, but for the most part, if you go to most Episcopal parishes, the version you'll hear is the New Revised Standard. And the Revised Standard is a revision of the King James. It traces its heritage back to the King James. Okay, I want to be mindful of our time, but I also want to try and get through as much as I can. So can we go for another 5-10 minutes? Are we doing okay? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let me talk briefly about sacraments. I haven't forgotten this stuff. We talk briefly about sacraments. Fundamentally, sacraments are one of the principal ways that we try to make sense amongst ourselves of how God is present and active in our midst. When I talked earlier about worship as being primarily about what God does for us, the sacraments are one of the key signifiers that we use to identify the way that we think God is present and active in this particular instance. What God is doing here is redeeming someone and is raising someone up to newness of life. What's happening here is that this person is being joined to the death and the new life of Jesus Christ. Let's call that baptism. Right? What's happening here is that we are being joined with Christ in his death and his experience of the Passover, and we're being united with him in fellowship with him in his death and resurrection. That's the Eucharist. Right? So every sacrament is intended to be an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. That's the language of the Catechism. And that's not exclusive to the Episcopal Church. You'll find lots of traditions using that language. An outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. Now, right away, one of the things we might ask is, what makes a sacrament? There are lots of things that are outward and visible signs. Do they all signify particular inward and spiritual graces? Well, probably not. Those things we call ceremonial. Right? Those things we call act of piety. There are things that are outward and visible signs that we don't think bear witness in quite the same way to particular acts of spiritual grace, so we don't call them sacraments. So, sign of the cross, not a sacrament. Acts of genuflection, not a sacrament. Prayer, perhaps not a sacrament. When we bless the blankets today, not really a sacrament. But it looks kind of sacramental because there's an outward and visible sign there. Well, okay. The inward and spiritual grace. Also, what specifically is happening here? Baptism is about what? Eucharist is about what? Matrimony is about what? What is happening here that makes these particular acts distinct from these other particular acts? And the thing that distinguishes a sacrament is that they bear witness to ways in which the Church has repeatedly, throughout its history, seen God present and active in the life of the Church. In other words, sacramental traditions recognize that over time, most often, this is how God shows up. We see God changing people's lives through these means. Through the prayers of thanksgiving, through the prayers of baptism, through burial, through matrimony, through ordination. These are the markers that consistently stand the test of time as testimonies to what we believe God is doing in and through the Church. So they bear witness to particular inward acts of grace in ways that other outward acts, important and meaningful as those might be, do not necessarily do. So that's what distinguishes a sacrament as such. It's something that has been kind of set apart and recognized in a distinct way as bearing witness to a particular act of God's grace. When we do this, God is present in ways that are harder for us to recognize if we don't. It may not be that God is not, it's not so much that God is not present if we don't do it, but it's much easier for us to recognize what God is doing at this particular place, at this particular time. If we do this, we'll do it like that. So there are two principal, or what we might call dominical sacraments in the Episcopal Church, 5 sacramental rites. And of course, Christians disagree on this. So you talk to the Eastern Orthodox or the Roman Catholic tradition, Missouri Synod Lutheran, they'll have a different answer to this. You talk to Baptists, non-denominational, whatever, they'll have a different answer for this. We recognize 2 principal sacraments, baptism and Eucharist, and we recognize 5 sacramental rites. Rites that, for all intents and purposes, are sacramental in the same way that baptism and Eucharist are, but we don't quite feel comfortable enough claiming them to have the same status as baptism and Eucharist. Confirmation, ordination, marriage, reconciliation, and unction. Some of you from liturgical backgrounds recognize those. Let's see. Both baptism and Eucharist are primarily about discipleship. Baptism and Eucharist have much more to do with our participation in the act of God in our life than they do with just about anything else. Right? Both of them are intended to shape us and to help us conform our lives to what we believe God is doing in and through Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit. Baptism is that sign that we use to recognize that we are joined with Christ in his death and are thus joined with him in his new life. And as such, are recipients of the Holy Spirit, of his gift of the Holy Spirit. We are a new creation after baptism, which is one reason why the baptism of infants can sometimes seem kind of a little off-putting, because no sooner do you have a child, no sooner is your child born to you, than it dies. I mean, to put it radically, right? And a new child is born. There's a story in the Old Testament that kind of makes this point, the story of the birth of Samuel the prophet. Hannah's been childless for many years. She's praying for a child. God God gives her a child. She gets the gift of a child. She goes to the temple and she says to the priest, look at this wonderful blessing that God has given to me. After praying for years and years and years, I have the gift of a child. This is phenomenal. I give this child to God. And she leaves. That's baptism. If what you're doing is baptizing an infant. You bring your newborn child into the church and you say, this is no longer mine, this is yours. And then God gives it back and says, now raise it. And good luck with that.
Then a parent, you know how important that is. You get it back to God as
Quickly as possible. Where's my waiver? I'll at least sign the waiver. But it's primarily, I mean, if you read through, I mean, if you were to take a look, say, at, where is it here? Pages 304 and 305, that's the Baptismal Covenant. That's the promise that is made, the promise that God makes to us and the promise that we make to God in baptism. There are a series of promises there that are all about the shape and the structure and the organization of our lives. Will you promise to think this way about God and the world and yourself? Does this particular articulation of who you are and who God is and the way the world works, does this make the best sense to you? Does this particular articulation of the life of faith make the best sense of you? Because they're very concrete, very practical commitments. I'm going to promise to do this. I'm going to do this thing. Not just I'm going to feel this thing or I'm going to think this thing. I'm going to do this. Every promise that is made in baptism is a behavioral one. So it basically is the first step on the path to discipleship. I'm going to increasingly conform my life to these commitments, knowing that I'm going to screw it up. Right in the middle of that, there's a commitment to basically playing the long game. Will you persevere? Right in the middle of the promises of baptism. Will you persevere in the apostles' teaching and fellowship, in the breaking of the bread? And when you fall into sin, when you fall into sin, will you repent and return to the Lord? Yes, I will. I'm in this for the long haul because it's going to take the long haul to get me to where I want to be. So, baptism as a path to discipleship. Those are expressed most clearly in the promises that are made in baptism. Similarly, the Eucharist is an invitation to discipleship by virtue of what it is we do when we celebrate the Eucharist. When we celebrate the Eucharist, what do? We bring forward the gifts and the offerings of our lives. This is why the bread and the wine are brought forward from the congregation. You're not going to go out there and find wine laying around, right? You're not going to go out there and find bread laying around ready-made. We have to make that stuff. And having made that stuff, we bring it before God and we say to God, here is something we have made. From the gifts you have given to us, you gave us raw materials, we made this. Bless this, use these to allow them to be vehicles of your grace to us. We break them, and then we share them. We give them, God gives them to us, we give them to God. God gives them back to us, we give them to the world. The actions of the Eucharist are intended to kind of give us a model for thinking about every other dimension of our lives. God, you have given me this. I give this back to you, expecting you're going to give it back to me so that I can give it to the world, to the honor and glory of your name. God, you have given me this job. God, you have given me this marriage. God, you have given me this difficult person. God, you have given me this whatever. Right? You have given me something. I'm going to take that. I'm going to offer it back to you, expecting that you can turn it into a vehicle of grace. You give it back to me, and then I share it with the world, to the honor and glory of your name. The actions of the Eucharist invite us into reflection on how every dimension of our lives can bear witness to that same pattern. That pattern of kind of constant mutual exchange. Here, you take it. No, you take it. No, you take it. And every time it gets passed off, it's better than it was the last time, right? It's the gift that keeps on giving, right? Starts out as raw material, gets passed off as something else. Comes back to you filled with grace, gets passed out as something else. So, that's why baptism and Eucharist are the principal sacraments for the regulation of the life of the local community. Because those are the two things that help us kind of sort out our life with one another and then sort out our individual lives and turn those into opportunities for worship. When you learn to live according to the promises made in baptism, you're living a baptismal life. When you learn to live according to the pattern of the Eucharist, you're living a Eucharistic life. Every moment becomes an opportunity to celebrate Eucharist in the pattern and according to the manner in which you learn as a member of the covenant community. Okay, let me pause and see how we're doing, and then I'm going to get to these questions. How's everyone holding on? Okay? Okay. Quickly then. All may, let's see, how's it go? All may, some do, none must. That is the rule to remember for acts of piety in the Episcopal Church. All may, everybody can. Some do, none must. Nothing is obligatory. You will note that if you have any familiarity with the Eastern Orthodox tradition, we observe the Western pattern for the crossing. We go head, down, left shoulder, right shoulder. That's the opposite of our Eastern brothers and sisters. Head, down, right, left. Now there's some differences there. But basically this is done anytime there is a particular reference to the crucifixion, certainly, or a particular reference to the sacrificial act of Christ on our behalf, or an expression of blessing. Those tend to be the points at which that shows up most prominently.
Do you mind to say again what side?
We do?
Yes.
Yeah, we do head, solar plexus, left shoulder, right shoulder.
And you don't go back.
Some people finish here. But again, all may, some do, none must. Are we going to throw you out if you do this? No. if someone who's Orthodox is in the congregation, they may look at you and go, oh, like for example, you'll see if you're ever at a celebration with Bishop Sumner, watch Bishop Sumner the way he crosses himself. He does it in a way that is informed by the practice. I think he got this from some parts in the church in Africa, but he will start here. When he makes the sign of the cross, he'll go like this. And a big cross, And like our Orthodox brothers and sisters, they'll go like this. All the way down, all the way across. Right? Cover the whole thing. So, sign of the cross, other acts of piety like genuflection. You will see people genuflecting chiefly in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. Some churches have what is referred to as a tabernacle or an ambo up front, where the leftover elements from communion are reserved for later use. We've got one of those behind the altar up there. So all the elements that are in that ambo, that are in that box on the reredos right behind the altar, those have already been consecrated, and those are ready for distribution for communion. So some people will genuflect in the presence of the Blessed Sacraments, because that particular sacrament is a sign of the presence and the activity of Christ. So when you see people first come into church, going into their pews before they sit down, they will genuflect because they're kind of acknowledging Christ is present already.
How do you know if there's something in the box or not?
You can tell if there's something in the box by virtue of the candle that's up there. If there's a candle burning, there's something in the box. If there's no candle burning, there's nothing in the box.
And it would be strange to genuflect if the candle's not burning.
If there's nothing up there, then the genuflection is kind of like, what are you doing? I mean, again,
Glasses on.
if you want to do it, go right ahead. I mean, no one's going to throw you out for doing it. But because everything in the liturgy means something, everything should be done intentionally, right? Why am I doing this right now? Am I doing it because the person next to me is doing it? Or am I doing it because this is drawing me deeper into a better sense of the presence and activity of God? If you're doing it for that reason, I don't care what you do whatever you want to do, right? But if you're doing it because the person next to me is doing it, or because I saw somebody else do it, or because this is what they used to do at my other congregation, no, there's nothing accidental in the liturgy. Everything means something. Esther?
Are you referring to that silver box?
Yes, indeed.
It's like an angel, is it?
No, it's actually just an abstract design.
Okay.
Yeah.
An angel.
Yeah. Yeah, if you look immediately behind the altar, right behind this, where the celebrant is standing during the celebration of communion, in the celebration of the Great Thanksgiving, immediately behind the celebrant, there's a box with some turquoise stones on it like that. Opens it up, yeah, that's what we're talking about. Some churches will have it over there on the wall. Like if you go into the St. Michael Chapel, we have one there, but it's not behind the altar, it's off on the side. And there's a candle hanging over by the side, and that candle is lit to signify the sacrament is present. Which is why during Maundy Thursday and Good Friday, Maundy Thursday we have what we call the stripping of the altar. At the end of the Maundy Thursday observance, all the liturgical appointments, every bit of liturgical whatever, accoutrement is taken out, and the whole sanctuary is stripped in preparation for the observance of Good Friday. And the last thing to be removed is the sacrament. And when that's emptied, the light goes out, and the ambo is left open. And it's desolate. I mean, it is desolate. When you are used to having the sacrament there all year round, and then all of a sudden you come into the church and you're confronted by an empty elbow, it's like, whoo! It's just, right to the gut. So, look for the light. If you've got a light, you're good to go.
So Andrew,
Yep.
is that like common knowledge? And if it is, where's the book? I mean, how do you learn this stuff?
Come to this class.
Did you ever see the movie A Few Good Men with Tom Cruise? Yeah. Remember the scene where they got the witness on the stand and he takes the book and he says, "So tell me where the mess hall is."
Okay.
You just learn it. I mean, it's not in the book.
That's a good enough answer.
Yeah. I mean, are there manuals of devotion? Yes, there are. There's an Anglican Missal. There's other kind of slender. During the 18th and 19th, early 20th centuries, there were popular manuals of devotion published with some regularity, some of which were quite elaborate, typically towards the more what we call Anglo-Catholic side of the church, for people who are really into their devotions. And they would prescribe, on this day you're supposed to do this with this manual action and say this prayer. So it can get quite elaborate. But it gets as elaborate as it does because it's profoundly meaningful. When you really commit yourself to that discipline, it's pretty striking what happens to your spiritual life. So they're out there, but there is not kind of a book that will say this is what you're supposed to do every. And you'll notice too, some of you probably already noticed, that there are moments in the prayer book where you have a choice to do this or to do that, and the community has basically prescribed, as a community, we're going to do this. Even though the prayer book accommodates this, as a community, we've recognized that this is how we're going to do it. So when we do the Eucharistic prayer, right, when we're saying the Great Thanksgiving, after we sing the Sanctus, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, heaven and earth are full of the blah, blah, blah. And if you're at the 11 o'clock service, the bell rings, what does everybody do? They hit their knees. Do you have to kneel at that point? No. The prayer book actually says stand or kneel. It's fine. Here at St. Michael, we're going to kneel. Go to some other congregations, you'll see everybody standing. Go to some other congregations, you'll see some people standing, some people kneeling. So every congregation kind of has liberty to decide this is how we're going to do it here. Do you have to have 50 people in your procession to have a legitimate procession? No, you don't. Do you have to have a procession? No, you don't. Do you have to have an entrance in? No, you don't. We do it here because that's how we do it. But we do it not just because that's the way we do it, but because these things are intended to signify something. Right? Even
for me, the value of everything you do has a purpose behind it. There's a historical purpose, meaning behind it. It's all focused on the worship.
Well, even the procession, right? Why do we have a procession at the beginning? Well, to get the ministers into place. No. We have a procession because it looks cool. No. We have a procession because the procession itself symbolizes the assembly of the people of God before the altar. The people of God are now gathered, and we have now come into this space, and we are now present here, facing God. That's why we process. Why do we have a departing procession? Is it just we got to get the ministers out of the front? Is it just, here's your cue to leave? No. The people of God, having experienced the grace of the Scriptures and the sacraments, are sent out in mission. That's why there's a dismissal immediately before the procession. Go in peace, get out of here to love and serve the Lord, right? Go out those doors into the world in mission. Watch us do that, departing procession. That's what the processions are intended to signal. So if you know that everything means something, then you can kind of track the liturgy as it unfolds and experience the fullness of the meaning. But if it just looks like this weird thing that people are, why is it good? Whatever. I mean, I guess if you like it, fine. If you don't, no big deal. But no, everything is intended to.
And what you all might see, which I'm sure is intentionals, when they process out, there's a intentional prayer that's prayed.
I'm sorry, there's
an intentional prayer that's prayed for the acolytes that have left the building.
Right, yes. Right. Okay. Transubstantiation. Do Episcopalians believe in transubstantiation? Well, that's complicated. Episcopalians believe in the real presence of Christ. They are very skittish about pinning it down. Do we believe Christ is fully present? Yes, absolutely. Do we believe that the sacrament of the Eucharist symbolizes that presence and makes that presence manifest in a way that no other sacrament does? Yes. Do we panic if the bread hits the floor? Not quite. Jesus knows how to get into the bread. Jesus knows how to get out of the bread. So there is a profound reverence for the Eucharist. There is a profound sense that in the celebration of the Eucharist, Christ is fully present and is really present. There's an Anglican theologian in England who's actually done some work on this that I find quite compelling. And his argument is basically, look, did Jesus come to transform bread and wine, or did Jesus come to transform you? What is being transformed in the Eucharist? Are we the ones undergoing transformation, or are the bread and the wine the things undergoing? Well, the bread and the wine are undergoing transformation, but precisely for the purpose of transforming us. Right? It's not just that we transform these elements and then leave them on the altar and everyone back away and now reverence the elements. We take the elements, we break them, and then we take them into ourselves. So it is you who are primarily to be transformed, and it is primarily in you and in the fellowship of the body that the presence of Christ is manifest. And is that presence manifest in a special and particular way in the celebration of the Eucharist? Absolutely. But do we believe, does every Episcopalian believe in the literal transubstantiation of the essence of the bread and the wine into the body and blood of... Some Episcopalians will absolutely have no problem with that and will say, absolutely. Other Episcopalians will say, not so much. As a church, we have not taken a particular position on Eucharistic theology that says this is what it means. If you look, the two kind of interesting places that I would point you to in the prayer book, well, there's actually several places I would point you to. There's the Catechism in the back that talks about this. There's also a section immediately right adjacent to that called the 39 Articles. That was basically the catechism for one of the first prayer books, one of the first American prayer books. There's an article in there specifically on transubstantiation, from which we have backed away a little bit, because the article in the 39 Articles basically says, we don't believe this. And since that time, well, yeah, there's some legitimacy to that. There's some merit to that. The other thing I would suggest is that if you read through the Eucharistic prayers themselves, they each contain a particular Eucharistic theology. So what does Eucharistic Prayer A say about the presence and activity of Christ in the sacrament? What does Eucharistic Prayer B say? What does C say? What does D say? And how do those compare to what we've got in the Catechism and the 39 Articles? That would kind of be your starting point, your baseline for Episcopal Eucharistic theology. Thoughts on that?
I love it.
Okay. Rite 1 and Rite 2. Traditional language, contemporary language. The Rite 1, all those rites basically come more or less directly from the 1928 prayer book. So the language is the most noticeable difference, although the spirituality and the theology of those rites is a little different from the spirituality and the theology of the Rite 2 services. So if you were to open up Rite 1, you would hear a lot more of these and thous, and you would hear language that sounds to us a bit more churchy, a bit more traditional. If you were to open up any of the Rite 2 services, you would hear language that sounds much more contemporary and accessible and kind of close to hand. Theologically, I would say that Rite 1 kind of gets a bad rap. I think Rite 1 is some beautiful language, and so there's some great theology in there as well. Rite 1 often gets, I think, stereotyped as being more penitent than Rite 2. More penitent. Rite 1 is a bit more willing to acknowledge the debt that we owe to God, whereas Rite 2 tends to be a bit more celebratory. And I'm painting with a very big brush at this point. I mean, if you put Eucharistic Prayer A, which is Rite 2, alongside Eucharistic Prayer B, which is also Rite 2, you'll notice that same difference. I would say that Eucharistic Prayer A tends to be a bit more penitent than Eucharistic Prayer B. It's a matter of degrees at this point, but the Rite 1 language and the Rite 1 theology tends to be a bit more dependent on the practice that was observed in the 28 prayer book and before, and the 79 stuff tends to be a bit more contemporary. Although, interestingly enough, one of our Rite 2 services is actually our oldest Eucharistic prayer. Eucharistic Prayer D, which is the last four of the Rite 2 Eucharistic prayers actually dates from the 5th century and was written by Basil of Caesarea. So that, I mean, we've been praying, Christians have been praying that prayer for 2,000 years. And that's an extraordinary prayer. We use it at St. Michael most often on high observances, high holy days. So Christmas you'll hear it, Easter you'll hear it, other big days you'll hear it. Why do we have multiple crosses? The crosses in the processions are intended to signify kind of different sections of the procession. So kind of different groups of ministers are clustered behind the different crosses. So you've got kind of the entrance procession, which signifies everybody, all the people kind of gathered together, and then you'll have a cross to demarcate the people who serve, particularly at the altar, and then you'll have another cross to demarcate the people who preach and the people who celebrate, the clergy. If we had a bishop, or if we had the presiding bishop, oftentimes a bishop will also be preceded by a cross. So they tend to be just kind of honorifics, kind of recognitions that here's a chunk, here's a chunk, here's a chunk. Each of these people are ministers, but they each have a slightly different order of ministry and a slightly different authority of ministry, kind of a thing. And then we've talked a little bit about the daily office already. So, okay. Thank you for your patience. I hope this has been helpful. I apologize for keeping you here as long as I did. If you want to stick around and continue to talk, I'm happy to do so.
One question.
Please, go.
When will the video be available online?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I'll bet if you're here next week, they will be able to tell you that. Chan, do you have any ideas to when the video?
It might be Cedric.
I'm sorry?
Cedric will upload it and send it out.
And if you want to email me, I'll give you my card. I can give it to you.
So, okay, thank you for coming. Thank you for your patience. Appreciate your attention. Be blessed.